So, can anybody tell me why you're here today? Maple syrup, that's right. What about it? You going to eat it? Okay, yeah, you're going to eat it. And you're also going to learn how it's made. So, what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to turn this stuff here into this stuff. Okay? Now, does anyone know what this is? And it's not water. Water. Not water, no. Vodka, that's water. Yeah. Right, if vodka in the trees, I wouldn't be making maple syrup. This is called sap. And this is what comes out of the tree. And you're right, when you say water, it's about 95% water, even more. It's just a very little bit of sugar in this. Okay? And then what we have to do is we have a machine called an evaporator up in another building that we're going to walk to. And the evaporator can boil it down and turn it into this stuff, which is pure maple syrup. Okay? There's absolutely nothing added to this. All we do is boil down the sap and we turn it into maple syrup. No sugar added, nothing. That's why you have to have that word pure in front of it. If it doesn't say pure at the store, don't buy it. Okay, because it's only half pure or not pure at all. Quite often, Aunt Jemima. Anybody ever eat Aunt Jemima pancake mix? That's a dirty word around here. We don't say that word. It's just like swearing, okay? I'm just kidding. But Aunt Jemima is not maple syrup. Okay? It's not maple syrup. All right. Now, before we talk about that, we're going to have a little history lesson. So, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, maple sugar was being made. And it was being made by the native people of North America. Some people like to call them Indians, some people call them Aboriginals, but native people of North America. Okay? Now, the native people of North America lived in what we call the Stone Age. There were no pots, no iron pots of any kind. So they had to figure out a way to boil that syrup down, or that sap down, and make it into maple sugar. And this is how they did it. They would hollow out a log like this, but much bigger. This is a scale model. Okay? So the log would stretch from me probably over to here. Great big log. They'd hollow it all out like this, and then they'd fill that log full of sap. Okay? So they'd dump the sap into the log. Okay? Once the log was full, they'd build a big fire right beside it. And when the fire was going really good, they'd put rocks in the fire. And when the rocks were really, really hot, they'd pick them up with a stick, put them in the sap. Back and forth, until finally they boiled it down so far that it turned into maple sugar, little crystals, granular sugar. Okay? And once they had that sugar made, they'd put it in birch bark containers like this, and they called those mokucks. Okay, that birch bark container was called a mokuk. So that's how the natives did it for thousands of years. And then the pioneers started coming in, the first immigrants came across in their sailing ships, right? And they saw what the natives were doing, and they said, that's a good idea. So they started making it too. And at the beginning, they did it exactly the same way the natives did. Well, almost the same. I'll get to that in a minute. But when it came time to tap the tree, they thought it might be better to drill a hole in the tree using an auger. Okay? Once they had the hole in the tree, they would put a little gadget in the tree called a spile. And the sap would drip out of this spile and drip into a bucket. Now the first spiles, as you can see here, were made of wood. Okay? And they had a special kind of wood they liked to use. They liked to use staghorn sumac. And they used this because the center is very, very soft. It's spongy. So you just poke it out with a stick, right? So you just cut them to the proper length and then poke the center out and you have a spile on it. So staghorn sumac. Later on, we started making metal spiles. And today we use plastic spiles like this one, and I'll tell you more about the plastic spiles when we go up the hill. Now, damn, it's hot. Don't worry, that's all I'm taking off. All right, now when the pioneers started to boil their sap, they had one advantage over the native people. What did the pioneers have that the natives did not have? What are they? What is it?
Fire?
No, they had fire. What's this? Iron pots, right? So the pioneers, remember they weren't the Stone Age when the pioneers arrived, they had metal pots, and they learned very quickly it was best to use 3 pots. So what they would do is they'd fill this guy up, they'd boil it down 3/4 of the way, ladle it over into this one, boil this one down 3/4 of the way, and finally they'd finish it in this little pot. So you can see what's happening here. As we boil, the water's being boiled off, right? The water's disappearing, and the sugar's becoming more concentrated. So therefore, we're getting from syrup into sugar. Now, everything we do with maple products is done according to temperature. And today, we use one of these, which is a, what is it? Thermometer, right? We use a thermometer. But the pioneers didn't have thermometers. So what they would do, that's right. What they would do is they'd take a cold piece of metal and drop a few drops of the syrup on the metal. And if it turned hard right away, they knew it was the right temperature. Okay? And then they'd take it off and do what they had to do with it. Now quite often, when they took it off, they'd like to make some sweet treats for themselves, so they'd make molds like this, and when it was still liquid form, they'd pour it into the molds, and then when it hardened, you could just knock them out, and you'd have some sugar candies. Now, working in the sugar bush is very difficult work. So quite often they would make a gadget like this, they would hook on, and they'd hook their buckets or their mocucks onto this, and it's much easier to haul that with your shoulder and back muscles than your arms. Okay? Thank you. This is called a carrying yoke. A carrying yoke. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever worked in the sugar bush before, probably not, but I can guarantee you that it's very, very difficult work. Okay? So, quite often when we start carrying out those buckets in the sugar bush, there's 2 feet of snow in the sugar bush, so we have to wear snowshoes, like those ones hanging over there. See the snowshoes? Yeah. Put those on our feet. So here you are in the sugar bush, walking through 2 feet of snow, carrying 2 5-gallon pails, right? It's no fun. We're going to talk about how we change that. Now, when the pioneers first started, quite often they would make containers like this to catch their sap when it came out of the tree. And to make those containers, they had a special tool called an adze. Okay? And they could just take and chop those out and make them very quickly. Okay? Later on, when communities started being developed, they would have tradesmen that would come and live in those communities. And one of the tradesmen was called the cooper. And the cooper was the barrel and the bucket maker. And you might say, well, big deal. Why do we need a bucket and barrel maker for? Well, back then, everything was stored in buckets and barrels. So that guy was a very important person back in pioneer times. And this bucket here, which is over 100 years old, would have been made by a cooper. And this is it actually is a sap bucket made by a cooper. You see the little hook here where they would have hooked it onto the tree? So this would have collected the sap from the tree. Okay. Now, in order to tap trees, we have to know what kind of trees to tap. What kind of trees do we tap? Maple trees, right. Now, not quite as simple as that though, because in New Brunswick, we actually have 5 kinds of maple trees. We have striped maple. Why don't you guys say these after me? That's what I did? Yeah. Striped maple.
Striped maple. Everybody! Striped maple.
Oh, say them after me. I'm a grumpy old school teacher. I like to Mountain maple.
Mountain maple.
Sugar maple.
Sugar maple.
Silver maple.
Silver maple.
And red maple.
Red maple.
Now these two guys we do not tap, okay, so we'll forget about them. These three guys we do tap, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. Sugar maple likes to grow on real rich soil, so like garden type soil. So that's where you'll find them, where there's real good soil. Silver maple likes to grow along the riverbanks. So if you go along the Connectiosn River or the St. John River, quite often you'll find silver maple growing. And red maple can grow most anywhere. Okay? Most anywhere. Now here's how you identify these trees. If you look at the three leaves, they all look like a maple leaf, don't they? Sort of. But they are a little bit different. First of all, these two guys right here, they have little teeth or serrations on the edge of the leaf. Okay? This one doesn't have any teeth on it. It's smooth. So I tell the kids to remember, sugar is smooth. Okay? So that's how you can remember sugar maple. These two guys that have little teeth on them, as you go towards the center of the silver maple, it gets skinnier. So silver skinny. As you go towards the center of red maple, it gets wider, so red is fat. Okay, that's not a very nice word, but the kids remember that, right? So red is fat, silver skinny, sugar smooth. All right? So that's how we can identify the trees in the summertime. All right? In the summertime. Okay? Problem is, we tap trees in the wintertime. So we have to figure out another way to identify the tree. And the best way to do that is to use these little bumps on the twig. These little bumps are called buds. In another month or so, they're going to flush out and leaves are going to start to grow. But right now, we can look at the bud and we can look at where it is, what color it is, and what shape it is, and we can identify the tree. So first, you see a bud there, and you see one right across from it. That's called opposite buds. Only two families of trees in New Brunswick have opposite buds. The ash family and the maple family. Now, here's a question for you. If the buds are opposite and red and round, what kind of a maple do you think it came from?
Red.
Red maple, you're right. Or maybe silver maple, okay, because they're almost identical. You're not a biologist or anything, are you? No? Okay. Just a good listener. Now, if they're opposite and brown and pointed, they're off the sugar maple. Okay? So that's all you have to look for in the wintertime. Are they opposite? If they're opposite, what color are they and what shape are they? You can identify the tree. Good. Does anyone have any questions?
How long is the process?
The process? When we start collecting, we have a big holding tank. When we fill that big holding tank, then we'll fill the evaporator. And when we start boiling, it's usually 6 to 8 hours before we take any syrup off. Because that first boil is a longer one because everything's raw sap when you start. But after we get the first batch taken off, every 3 or 4 hours we'll take off another gallon or two. So if we've got lots of sap and we boil really hard. So, yeah.
How has it been this winter for production?
This winter has been the worst winter since I've started boiling.
Wow.
Usually we make about 30 gallons. This year we made 4.
Oh, wow.
So it's been the worst season yet. But Mother Nature's the boss, right? Global warming. I'll blame it on global warming.
So, what can a season vary? How long is your season usually?
Season usually runs 4 to 6 weeks in length, and it can start as early as late February, and it can start as late as early April. But in that time frame, you usually get from the 1st of March to the middle of April, you usually get 2 or 3 good weeks in there that you can boil. Okay? This year that wasn't the case. Any other questions?
Is that because we had so much snow?
No, it was because we either had real cold days and nights or real warm days and nights, but we never had a combination of the cold nights, warm days. So the sap never got a chance to get charged into the trees before it came out again. So, any other questions? More questions you ask, the less you have to go outdoors. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to head out in a minute. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to head up the hill. And we have 2 or 3 stops where we're going to stop, and I'll just talk briefly because I know it is pretty miserable out. Then when we get to the top of the hill, we're going to break into 2 groups. One group will go with Jim. He's going to show you how we make the maple syrup. The other group is going to go with me, and I'm going to show you what it tastes like. We're going to do sugar on snow, and then we'll switch.